August 1945. The war was finally over, yet for the people of Japan, peace did not feel like peace at all. Cities lay in smoldering ruins, food was scarce, and disease crept through the narrow streets like an invisible enemy. In one shattered village hospital, a young mother knelt over her feverish child, whispering prayers to gods who no longer seemed to answer. Her son's breathing was shallow, his skin burning, his life slipping away, but what happened next would defy everything she had been taught. The footsteps that echoed down the hallway did not belong to a Japanese doctor. There were none left. They belonged to Americans, the enemy. The soldiers her people had been told were demons, ruthless destroyers of children like hers. And yet among them walked women in white uniforms carrying medicine, water, and hope. American nurses. The mother's instinct was to shield her child, to pull him away. Hatred and fear wrestled with desperation. And then, as a nurse gently placed a cool cloth on the boy's forehead, something shifted. In that fragile moment, war's illusions collapsed, leaving only a mother, a child, and the stranger trying to save him. This is not the story of battles or bombs. It is the story of what happens after. The clash between vengeance and compassion, despair and healing. And it begins with a single question. When survival hangs in the balance, how does the human heart transform hatred into gratitude? Japan in the autumn of 1945 was a nation on its knees. From the smoldering wreckage of Tokyo to the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an entire country looked less like a civilization and more like the remnants of a nightmare. Once proud cities had been flattened into endless fields of rubble. Bridges lay twisted, railways snapped, and entire neighborhoods existed only as memories buried beneath blackened stone. But it was not just the cities that suffered. It was the people. Hunger was everywhere. Rice, once the staple of every meal, became a rare luxury. Mothers wandered through markets that no longer had food, clutching scraps of vegetables or powdered barley. Children with hollow eyes lined the streets, their ribs visible, their bellies swollen from malnutrition. Disease spread quickly. Dysentery, pneumonia, and tuberculosis struck without mercy. Hospitals overflowed, yet most lacked medicine, clean water, or even trained staff to care for the sick. The psychological toll was just as devastating as the physical destruction. For years, Japanese propaganda had painted their nation as invincible, bound by honor and sacrifice. But now that illusion was shattered. Soldiers returned home broken, industries were silent, and the emperor's surrender had left civilians grappling with a new, crushing emotion: defeat. The pride that once fueled their will to fight dissolved into shame and uncertainty. Families asked themselves, who are we now if not warriors? Into this chaos came a darker fear, the fear of dependence. Rumors spread of American forces entering towns, and whispers carried a chilling question: could the enemy be trusted? For mothers clutching starving children, survival demanded a cruel choice. To accept food or medicine from the very people they had been taught to hate felt like surrendering dignity. It was in this fragile, wounded landscape that the stage was set for an encounter that would change everything. The ruins of Japan were not just physical. They were emotional, spiritual, and deeply psychological. And it was here, amid hunger and despair, that American footsteps would soon be heard not as conquerors, but as unexpected saviors. For years, Japanese civilians had been told that Americans were monsters. Posters and radio broadcasts described them as barbaric invaders who would murder children and dishonor women. Mothers whispered warnings at night: if the Americans come, hide, because they will take everything from us. The war had ended, but those fears did not vanish with the emperor's surrender. So when the first American soldiers appeared in towns and villages, panic swept through the streets. Women pulled their children close, men avoided eye contact, and elders muttered prayers as if preparing for the inevitable. Boots on the ground meant danger, at least that is what everyone believed. But reality looked very different. Instead of violence, the soldiers carried crates of food. Instead of cruelty, they handed out chocolate and chewing gum to wide-eyed children. The enemy smiled, offered blankets and extended hands of help. Yet suspicion lingered. Could kindness really be trusted from those who had just burned their cities? One account tells of a young mother in Yokohama whose daughter was burning with fever. When an American nurse approached with medicine, the mother's instinct was to recoil, clutching the child tightly to her chest. For a moment, fear seemed stronger than hope. But the nurse knelt, smiled gently, and held out the small bottle of penicillin. Against every lesson drilled into her by wartime propaganda, the mother allowed it. Days later, when the girl opened her eyes again, the mother's tears fell not from grief but from relief and gratitude to the very people she had once feared. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the clash between deeply ingrained beliefs and undeniable new experiences. For the Japanese, the enemy had suddenly become the savior. For the Americans, former adversaries became patients, fragile and human. Each encounter chipped away at propaganda, forcing civilians to see reality not in absolutes of good or evil, but in acts of compassion that defied ideology. Still, trust was not immediate. Every gesture of kindness was weighed against years of terror. Every gift of food carried the shadow of suspicion. And yet the seed of transformation had been planted, step by step, encounter by encounter. Fear gave way to something unexpected, hope. The war had been fought with bombs and bullets, but in the ruins, a quieter battle began. The struggle inside the human heart to accept mercy from those once called monsters. And it was in this fragile space that a new figure appeared, the American nurse. They arrived quietly, without the roar of bombers or the thunder of artillery. Instead, their entrance was marked by the soft rustle of white uniforms and the clinking of medical kits. American nurses, young women, many no older than 25, stepped into the ruins of Japan carrying the tools of healing rather than destruction. Most of them had been trained in the chaos of battlefield hospitals. They had stitched up soldiers under gunfire, comforted the dying in muddy trenches, and learned to work with calm precision while surrounded by blood. Yet here their mission was different. Their patients were not comrades in arms, but civilians who had once been defined as the enemy. Take, for instance, Lieutenant Helen Davis, a nurse from Ohio who had grown up on a farm before joining the Army Nurse Corps. She had never seen a Japanese civilian before the war. Now she found herself kneeling beside mothers in bombed-out clinics, holding the hands of feverish children who reminded her of her younger siblings back home. Or Lieutenant Mary Alvarez, whose parents had fled poverty in Mexico, now offering vaccines to infants who had survived the firestorms of Tokyo. These women carried more than medicine. They carried stories, humanity, and a quiet strength forged by war. For the nurses themselves, the shift was profound. On battlefields, they had been taught to harden their hearts against the constant drumbeat of death. But here their work required vulnerability, meeting eyes filled with suspicion, reaching across a gulf of language, and proving through action that compassion knew no borders. At first, many Japanese mothers resisted, their fear visible in trembling hands and guarded expressions. Yet the nurses persisted. A gentle touch on a child's forehead, a careful injection. Tess smiled despite the language barrier. Each gesture chipped away at the wall of mistrust. The presence of these nurses marked more than just medical relief. It was symbolic. In uniforms once associated with war, they represented the possibility of peace. And as their reputation spread from village to village, whispers of healing began to replace whispers of fear. It was in these quiet, fragile beginnings that the first stories of tears and gratitude would emerge. The first time it happened, silence filled the room before the tears came. A boy no older than 6 lay gasping for air on a straw mat in a clinic outside Yokosuka. His mother had already prepared herself for loss. She had buried 2 children during the war and believed this one would follow. Fever racked his body, his breath shallow and broken. When the American nurse entered with penicillin, a medicine almost unknown in Japan, his mother froze. To accept help meant to trust the very people she had been taught to hate. The nurse knelt, spoke softly in English the mother did not understand, and administered the injection. Hours passed. The boy stirred. By morning, his breathing had steadied. For the first time in weeks, his eyes opened. The mother collapsed to the ground, bowing so deeply her forehead touched the floor, her tears spilling onto the mat. She did not see an enemy anymore, only the woman who had saved her child. Stories like this multiplied. In Nagoya, an infant wasting away from malnutrition was kept alive when nurses taught mothers how to prepare high-protein milk rations distributed by U.S. forces. In Osaka, a girl near death from pneumonia survived after a nurse spent the night at her side, sponging her fever and whispering lullabies she could not understand, yet which conveyed comfort all the same. Each survival became a quiet miracle, shared in whispers across neighborhoods and villages. The Americans saved them. The emotional weight of these moments was immense. For Japanese mothers, gratitude was tangled with guilt. They had once cursed the enemy, who now restored their children to life. Many wept openly, ashamed of their hatred yet overwhelmed by relief. For the nurses, too, the experience was transformative. They had expected suspicion, perhaps even hostility. Instead, they found themselves embraced, sometimes literally by women who clung to them in tears, unable to express in words the depth of their gratitude. Psychologically, these encounters revealed something universal. Maternal instinct, the primal drive to protect a child, proved stronger than ideology. Propaganda dissolved the moment a mother saw her child recover. Gratitude rewrote narratives more powerfully than fear. And in this fragile human exchange, the wall between conqueror and conquered cracked. These were not grand political gestures or speeches broadcast over radios. They were small, intimate victories, measured in the steady breath of a sleeping child, the tear-streaked face of a relieved mother, and the gentle persistence of a nurse who refused to see an enemy, only a patient. From these beginnings, a ripple spread across devastated Japan. Mothers who had once hidden their children at the sight of Americans began to seek them out, carrying their sick infants to clinics, lining up outside makeshift hospitals, whispering desperate prayers that the strangers in white could perform another miracle. And time and again, those miracles came. In the beginning, every gesture was awkward. The American nurses spoke no Japanese, and most mothers knew no English. Words failed, but survival demanded communication. A mother would bow low, her forehead nearly touching the floor, while the nurse instinctively reached out to lift her by the shoulders, unsure of the custom. The exchange often ended in nervous laughter or in silence, but it carried meaning all the same. Language barriers could have created distance, yet in many ways they brought people closer. Without words, the nurses relied on tone, touch, and expression. A gentle hand on a child's wrist, a smile offered through fatigue, a nod of reassurance. These small acts conveyed more than speeches could. For mothers, each gesture chipped away at fear. Compassion, they discovered, needed no translation. Still, moments of misunderstanding were common. Japanese etiquette demanded deep bows and deference, while the American women, raised on informality, preferred eye contact and easy warmth. To some mothers, a smile held longer than expected felt almost intrusive. To the nurses, a refusal to meet their gaze seemed cold. Yet day by day, these cultural gaps narrowed, replaced by a language built on shared humanity. The cry of a child in pain, the sigh of relief when fever broke, the quiet gratitude in a mother's tears. Psychologists describe this as the power of nonverbal communication, the way human beings forge bonds through instinct rather than intellect. In the ruins of Japan, this truth played out in its purest form. Enemy propaganda had painted Americans as inhuman, yet their touch revealed tenderness. For the nurses, Japanese civilians had been faceless figures in war reports, yet here they were, mothers and children, fragile and human. The bonds that grew were fragile, built not on ideology or treaties, but on something far more enduring, empathy. And as those bonds deepened, they prepared the ground for an even more profound transformation, when propaganda itself would collapse under the weight of lived experience. For years, propaganda had been Japan's invisible weapon. Radio broadcasts, school textbooks, even children's songs drilled one lesson into the mind. The Americans were devils. Mothers were told that if captured, their children would be slaughtered. Children were warned that Americans were beasts who delighted in cruelty. This psychological armor was meant to fortify a defeated nation against surrender, to convince people that death was preferable to capture. But reality, once witnessed, is far stronger than words. When Japanese mothers saw their children recovering in the arms of American nurses, the entire architecture of fear collapsed. The supposed monsters wiped brows, measured pulses, and handed out food. Each act of kindness became a hammer blow against years of indoctrination. This was cognitive dissonance in its purest form. How could the enemy also be the savior? For many, the mind reeled. Some mothers wept not only from relief, but from the crushing realization that everything they had believed about Americans was a lie. The shame was almost unbearable, yet so was the gratitude. For the American side, the reversal was equally striking. Soldiers who had spent years seeing Japanese forces as relentless enemies now watched their nurses cradle starving infants. They witnessed civilians bow in thanks, their eyes wet with tears. In place of hostility came respect, and with it, the recognition that mercy could accomplish what military might could not. This transformation struck at the core of wartime psychology. Propaganda had dehumanized, but compassion rehumanized. The power dynamic of conqueror and conquered shifted. Americans held dominance, yet chose to wield it through care rather than cruelty. That choice rewrote the narrative not only for the Japanese civilians, but also for the occupiers themselves. In the end, the greatest psychological weapon turned out not to be fear, but kindness. And in that reversal lay the foundation for a fragile trust, one that would slowly rebuild a shattered nation. The healing of Japan did not happen overnight. The ruins still stood, the wounds of war still raw. Yet within that devastation, something remarkable began to grow. In towns once choked by ash and hunger, makeshift clinics slowly became centers of hope. American nurses worked alongside Japanese midwives, training them to use modern medicine, teaching them to sterilize tools, and introducing treatments that had once seemed like miracles. Food, too, became part of the recovery. Where mothers had once boiled weeds for soup, now powdered milk and protein-rich rations reached starving children. Nurses patiently explained how to prepare the strange new foods, transforming them into lifelines for families on the brink. Each meal restored not just bodies but dignity, reminding civilians that survival was possible. The resilience of the Japanese people was astonishing. Families rebuilt homes from splintered wood, neighbors shared what little they had, and children who had once lain listless on mats began to play again in the rubble-strewn streets. Every small act of normalcy became an act of defiance against despair. Psychologists call this resilience, the human ability to adapt and recover after trauma. For mothers who had endured bombings, loss, and humiliation, the act of watching their children live carried a profound psychological effect. Gratitude slowly replaced grief, and trust, though fragile, took root where fear had once ruled. For the Americans, this resilience left a deep impression. They had come expecting bitterness, perhaps even hostility. Instead, they found communities willing to rise if only given a chance. The sight of children regaining strength, of mothers smiling despite their scars, revealed a truth often forgotten in war. People long above all else for life, not conflict. Step by step, clinic by clinic, Japan's recovery became not just a story of survival, but a story of rebirth. And the very nurses who had once knelt beside dying children now stood witness to a nation beginning to breathe again. The memories of those first encounters did not fade with time. For many Japanese mothers, the sight of an American nurse saving their child became an indelible moment, etched deeper than the traumas of war. Years later, they would still speak of it in hushed voices, how the enemy became a lifeline, how tears of grief turned into tears of gratitude. These stories passed down through families, whispered to children who had been too young to remember, until they became part of a new cultural memory. Psychologists understand this as the shaping of collective identity. Trauma can define a generation, but so can acts of compassion. In post-war Japan, gratitude became a counterbalance to shame. While defeat lingered like a shadow, the knowledge that Americans had chosen mercy instead of vengeance softened the bitterness of surrender. For mothers especially, the memory of nurses in white uniforms replaced propaganda's demons with human faces. On the American side, the impact was equally profound. Soldiers and nurses who had braced for hostility instead returned home with stories of warmth and reconciliation. Many wrote in diaries of children they could not forget, tiny faces that reminded them of their own siblings. These accounts circulated in newspapers and letters, helping to reframe Japan in the American imagination not as an eternal foe, but as a people in need of friendship. The long-term psychological consequences extended beyond individual memory. They influenced policy, diplomacy, and even future alliances. What began as a desperate act of humanitarian relief grew into the foundation of trust that underpinned US-Japan relations for decades. Compassion had achieved what occupation alone never could, a transformation of perception, from enemies defined by hate to partners capable of rebuilding together. History often remembers wars by their battles, yet in the quiet spaces after surrender, it is memory that carries the true weight. And in post-war Japan, those memories were not just of bombs and hunger, but of strangers who chose to heal. In the end, it always comes back to that single image: a mother, kneeling in the ruins of a hospital, clutching her child as American nurses worked to save him. In that moment, history itself seemed to bend. The enemy was no longer a faceless monster, but a young woman offering comfort. The war had ended with surrender, but the healing began with touch. This transformation was not written in treaties or political speeches. It was written in the eyes of children who opened them after fevers broke, in the hands of nurses who held infants with the same tenderness they would their own, in the tears of mothers who bowed lower than they ever had before. Each act of care carried weight far beyond medicine. It dismantled fear, rewrote memory, and revealed a truth hidden by propaganda. Humanity survives even in the ashes of war. The psychological shift was immense. For civilians, survival forced a choice between clinging to hatred or embracing gratitude. For nurses and soldiers, mercy proved more powerful than dominance. What began as suspicion grew into a fragile trust, and trust, in time, became the seed of reconciliation. History records battles, strategies, and treaties, but it is these quieter stories that explain how enemies become allies. In the decades that followed, Japan rose from the rubble to become a partner of the very nation that once bombed its cities. And while many forces shaped that rebirth, it cannot be denied that compassion played its part. The lesson endures: weapons can end wars, but they cannot heal wounds. Only humanity can do that. In the ruins of 1945, the world witnessed something profound. Not the triumph of one side over another, but the triumph of compassion over hatred, because in the end, the most powerful victory was not won on the battlefield. It was won in the quiet moments when a mother's tears fell, not for death but for life restored.